Hi class, welcome to the last lecture of Unit 6. And as you can tell from the title, we are going to reach the breaking point. We are going to reach the point where the Civil War begins. So I'm going to go through the final steps of the rising tension between the northern states and the southern states, between the federal government and the southern states. And at the end of this lecture, I'll review all the major causes of the Civil War, and then we'll be done with this unit. The next unit will be about the Civil War and Reconstruction. So we'll start off this lecture by talking about how Abraham Lincoln is elected and how the southern states react to his election. And then again, we'll talk about or go through a review of the causes of the Civil War and then into why Abraham Lincoln decided that war and fighting was necessary. And I will go ahead and tell you that even though the southern states left because of the issue of slavery largely, Abraham Lincoln's reason for fighting the war will not be slavery. It'll be about preserving the Union. I'll explain that more later on. So let's get to 1860. So when 1860 rolls around, the Republican Party has gotten even stronger, and the southern states feel even more threatened by the Republican Party. And the Republican Party is going to nominate Abraham Lincoln. The election of 1860 is the most crucial election in American history. It is the election in which basically it's what starts or sparks the Civil War, or at least Southern secession. So in the election of 1860, Republicans are going to run on a platform, and what's interesting about their platform is that they are not an abolitionist party, and I've said in the past that they are not an abolitionist party, but they don't want slavery expanding to the West, and that's still the case. In fact, if you were to ask Abraham Lincoln what his position on slavery was, Abraham Lincoln would say, I am not an abolitionist. I'm not trying to end slavery where it already exists, but I don't want it to expand westward. So the Republican Party platform and Lincoln's platform, at least publicly, was not an abolitionist one, but it did want to restrict the spread of slavery westward. But you have to remember that in the Southern mind, this was just as bad as being an abolitionist, because if slavery could not expand westward, then eventually the states that favored getting rid of slavery would way outnumber the states that wanted to keep slavery. So they did see this as a threat ultimately to slavery itself. So Lincoln is going to be so hated in his own time, especially by Southerners, which is interesting to note considering that he is considered by most historians to be one of the greatest presidents of all time. He's going to be so hated in the South that the Southern states would not even put his name on the ballot. Which begs the question, how did he get elected? Well, remember that in an election, it's not the popular vote that matters, it is the electoral vote that matters. And if you look at the Electoral College map, the northern states are worth a whole lot more than the southern states. You could add together almost all the southern states, and they pretty much would not add up to what New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio add up to. So basically, even though the South deliberately leaves Abraham Lincoln off the ballot entirely, if you look at the electoral vote totals, because Lincoln wins every northern state and because he wins the two new western states, Oregon and California, he doesn't need the majority of the population to win. Look at the percentage of the popular vote he gets. He gets less than 40% of the popular vote, but the electoral vote he gets well over half of. Now, so he's going to be your president-elect in 1860. And if you are a Southerner at this point, you're going to be very frustrated. And a lot of Southerners actually thought of themselves almost like the colonies had felt during the American Revolution. They said, we didn't even put this guy's name on the ballot, and here he is becoming president. To a lot of them, it represented, it was this idea of taxation without representation, except in this case, it was electing the president and not having any representation. In other words, the South felt, and they kind of were right in this, they felt like if they didn't want someone to become president, the North could entirely cancel out their votes and from here on out, the North and the West, if they teamed up, could choose every single president from this point forward. So the South and Southerners are going to say to themselves, we no longer have any true representation in this government. And if we have no true representation in this federal government, the federal government is going to be, in a sense, hijacked by the northern states or by the western states or both. And the federal government will ultimately be ruled by what the northern states wanted. And as we talked about in previous lectures, the northern states are becoming increasingly against slavery. Some of them just wanted to keep slavery from expanding westward. Some of them wanted to go so far as to abolish slavery. But overall, the northern states and the western states are not pro-slavery, and they have shown that they dominate in presidential elections. The South feels like it has no federal power in the federal government anymore. And so at this point, led by South Carolina, southern states are going to start seceding from the United States, and they're going to claim to create their own country. More on that in a moment. If you look at this political cartoon, it kind of shows the effect of the election of 1860, and it really did rip the country apart. Now, these southern states, whenever they form this new country, which they call the Confederate States of America, it's up for debate whether or not they actually form their own country, because there's going to be a war for their independence called the Civil War. And ultimately, they're not going to win that war, so they never successfully secede from the Union, so it's debatable whether or not they actually were ever their own country. In fact, the federal government's position and Abraham Lincoln's position will be that they never became their own country because they never did win their independence, and thus were more accurately defined as rebelling states. And that's important to note because when the Civil War ends, Lincoln is not going to want to treat the southern states like a conquered country, but he's going to think more in his mind that the country needs to be reunited and the states need to be brought in as easily as possible. More on that when we get to Reconstruction in Unit 7. So at the very end of 1860, but mostly in early 1861, you will see the secession of the Deep South states, led by South Carolina. So in late December of 1860, South Carolina is going to secede from the United States. So they're going to announce that they are breaking away from the United States. They feel they have no representation left. They feel like the northern states are going to hijack the federal government further and eliminate slavery, which again, their economy was based on. And so they will be the first state to secede from the Union. And there's going to be several months that pass before Lincoln gets sworn into office. Back then, you were elected in November, but you weren't sworn into office until early March. And so there are several months that pass where the current president, James Buchanan, basically just lets states secede and does virtually nothing about it. And the reason, if I remember correctly, is that Buchanan was not sure, or he did not think that he had the constitutional authority to keep states from leaving. And to be honest, the Constitution, so far as I know, doesn't really address the issue of secession. Regardless, historians look at Buchanan as one of the worst presidents in American history, largely because of his inaction whenever states were seceding from the Union. So by the time that Lincoln became president, was sworn into office, there were 7 states that had seceded from the Union, including, but not limited to, South Carolina. They're going to form, at least in their eyes, their own country called the Confederate States of America, or the CSA. Now, we've already talked about confederacies before, and sometimes this new quote-unquote country is referred to as the Confederacy. We already know that confederacies are weak. When you have a weak central government, it's hard to get things done, it's hard to pay for things, and guess what? The CSA, the Confederacy, is going to struggle to fight this war. It's remarkable how successful they are at fighting the war, given the fact that they had a weak central government. That being said, they did have a central government. It was initially placed in Montgomery, Alabama. Eventually, it's going to be moved. The capital is going to be moved to Richmond, Virginia. I'll come to that later. And they are going to elect Jefferson Davis to be the first and only ever president of the Confederacy. What's interesting is Jefferson Davis had served in the federal government before this point, and whenever his state seceded from the Union, he left the Senate. Congressmen that represented seceding states left Congress and joined the Confederate States of America, which left the federal Congress in Washington, D.C. with only northern and western congressmen and senators, which means that they're going to start passing laws that favor the North and the West during the Civil War, and I'll get to that point later on. Anyway, there you see a picture of Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederacy, the Confederate States of America. Now, most Americans did not want things to come to this point. They did not want secession to happen because they knew that if secession happened, a civil war to prevent secession might follow. And that's exactly what happens once Lincoln becomes president. And so there are going to be people throwing out last-ditch efforts to try to prevent this secession from happening, to encourage these southern states to come back in. And I'll get to that in a moment. If you look here, these southern states here, and my color blindness is coming through. I'm not sure what color these are, but the ones that are the same color as South Carolina, these deep South states, these are the ones that seceded by the time Lincoln took office. So Lincoln takes office with a crisis on his hands. And there are going to be other states that secede, the ones that are the same color as North Carolina and Virginia. These states, the upper South states, will secede a little bit later on, but it's going to take a special event for that to happen. And if you look at the map, it's talking about before and after Fort Sumter. So there will be something that happens at a fort called Fort Sumter. I'll talk about that shortly. At this point in time, these upper South states like North Carolina and Virginia, they don't like Lincoln. They didn't put Lincoln on the ballot, but they aren't upset enough to the point that they want to secede. So you could say that they're on the fence right now. For the sake of this class, they're on the fence. They're not pro-Lincoln, but they're not wanting to secede either. Events at Fort Sumter are going to force those states to make a choice to take a side. More on that shortly. On to the last-ditch effort. So I think it was February of 1861, it was early 1861, right as Abraham Lincoln is getting ready to take office, one last compromise will be offered. Now remember that Henry Clay is dead by this point. The great compromiser is no longer around to save the nation from itself. He's no longer around to help settle the issue of slavery, especially slavery in the West. But there will be a proposed compromise. And this proposed compromise is going to be known as the Crittenden Compromise. And the idea was to bring back the Missouri Compromise line, which doesn't make much sense to me because the Supreme Court had already ruled the Missouri Compromise to be unconstitutional, but I guess people were getting desperate. So the idea was bring back the Missouri Compromise line and go ahead and extend it past the old Louisiana Territory all the way to the West Coast. And if that happened, it would preserve slavery at least somewhat in the West, and maybe convince southern states not to leave. Unfortunately for the country's unity, but this will be in the long term good because it does lead to help lead to the end of slavery, Lincoln's going to say no to this. Lincoln's going to say, look, the Republican Party platform was not to allow slavery to extend to the West. I said I was not going to let slavery extend to the West. I'm still promising to leave it where it is, but I'm not going to break the promise of keeping it from spreading westward. Extending the bringing back the Missouri Compromise line and then extending it to the West Coast would have been a violation of that promise. It would have been a violation of both Lincoln and his party's platform. So he refuses to go along with this, and in the end, no compromise is reached, and it's about to get worse. More states are about to secede. So in 1861, on March the 4th, Abraham Lincoln is going to be sworn into office. And he, again, is going to inherit a problem. Now, if you look at this picture here, this is a picture from his inauguration, and he is at the Capitol Dome. And if you look at the map here, or not the map, the picture here, you can see that the Capitol Dome is being constructed. You can see a little bit of the scaffolding here. That's important to note. Because during the Civil War, the Capitol Dome is going to be built. And a lot of people said, why are you spending money building this Capitol Dome? And people like Lincoln said it was symbolic to show that even in the midst of Civil War, that the federal government was going to continue to function, that our country was going to continue to function. Okay, so by Lincoln's inauguration, again, the Confederacy has already started to form. 7 states have joined the Confederacy, and there is a big problem for Lincoln. These states that have claimed to secede from the Union also claimed that they owned the federal forts that were within the southern states. And the question for Lincoln was, what do you do with those forts? You have states claiming forts that are owned by the federal government. And if they take over these forts, that is a violent action. How are you going to supply these forts? They're going to run out of food eventually. What do you do with these forts? And ultimately, it's going to come down to Fort Sumter. Now, Lincoln is going to be very hesitant on the idea of just going in, marching into the South with troops and claiming these federal forts, because if he does so, the southern states can kind of claim that he's invading, and they can claim that the federal government is an invading force. They'll call it the War of Northern Aggression or something like that. So Lincoln has to play his cards very carefully at this point. So what Lincoln does is he takes a special fort that is a special situation, and that would be Fort Sumter. If you look here at Fort Sumter, it's in the middle of Charleston Harbor. If you've ever visited Charleston, South Carolina, it's a pretty cool town to visit, and you can see Fort Sumter from the town. You can see it out in the harbor. Now, the special thing about Fort Sumter is that Lincoln, if he wants to, he can resupply that fort without having to touch a square inch of southern soil. So if he takes a ship and he sends it to Fort Sumter, he can resupply it, even though the South is claiming it to be theirs, without the South being able to say that they're being invaded. So he plays his cards very carefully. He is a very smart man, and this was a very smart move on his part. So whenever he decides to resupply Fort Sumter, he's going to send a supply ship, not a warship, and he does that on purpose so that he can claim that he's not trying to start a war. He's basically going to get the South to fire first, and he can then claim that the South is the one that starts the fighting, and rightly so. So what happens is South Carolina and the rest of the Confederacy are going to claim that Fort Sumter belongs to South Carolina and to the Confederacy. And so what Lincoln's going to do is whenever he sends down the supply ship, he's going to force the Confederacy and South Carolina to make a decision. Are they going to claim this fort by force, or are they going to let the federal government resupply it? And so what happens is South Carolina and the Confederacy are going to order Fort Sumter and its federal troops to surrender. Now, if you've ever considered joining the military, even if you haven't considered joining the military, you know that ultimately the boss, the commander-in-chief of federal troops is the President of the United States. So when the people of Fort Sumter hear that the Confederacy wants them to surrender, they're going to say, of course, no. My commander-in-chief is not Jefferson Davis. My commander-in-chief is Abraham Lincoln. So they're going to say no. They're not going to surrender. And what this does is it forces the hand of South Carolina. It forces the hand of the Confederacy. And ultimately, on April the 12th at 4:30 a.m. exactly, you will see the bombardment of Fort Sumter begin. South Carolina is going to start firing upon Fort Sumter. You see it in the painting here. You see Fort Sumter, the interior of the fort after the firing happened, here. So what's interesting is that it is the South that fires the first shots of this war. They are the ones that use violence first, and they do manage to get the fort to surrender, and they capture the fort by force and violence. And what's interesting is that so far as I know, nobody dies during this bombardment. This is a very long bombardment that goes on during the morning, maybe even into the afternoon of April the 12th of 1861. But in the end, no one dies. And that's a very ironic point, because this becomes the bloodiest event in American history, but the first shots that were fired led to no deaths. But at this point, Lincoln has cleverly baited the South into firing first, and therefore can claim that the South is the one that is starting this war, not the federal government, not the northern states. So when this happens, the Civil War has begun. So if you look at that kind of jagged oval at the bottom of the front of your notes, that's where you put the Civil War began. So at this point, the Civil War has begun. We do not have any official battles yet. This was not really a battle. This was pretty one-sided. Fort Sumter got fired upon. I don't think that Fort Sumter ever really fired back. But the Civil War is going to begin, and the armies are going to begin assembling themselves. Now, the war itself has not started yet, or excuse me, it has started, but we haven't had any official battles. The first official battle will be the First Battle of Bull Run, and I'll talk about that in the next unit. First, though, I need to talk about further secession of other southern states, and I also need to do a review of the causes of the Civil War, where you will see many of the previous units kind of all come together. So at this point, Lincoln is going to make a call for troops. He's going to say to all the states, he's going to say, send me troops. I believe he called for 75,000 troops at first. And that's going to present a problem for these states that I pointed out earlier. These states, these upper South states, remember, they were kind of riding on the fence. They weren't really, they weren't pro-Lincoln, but they weren't pro-secession. But at this point, they have to make a choice. They're either going to give Lincoln troops to fight for the Union or the United States. Whenever you hear Union, think United States, the Union of the states. They're either going to give troops to Lincoln and the Union, or they're going to give troops to Davis and the Confederacy. And if they don't give troops to Lincoln, then they are disobeying the president, they are disobeying the federal government, and they will have therefore picked to side with the Confederacy. So you couldn't really say, I don't know. You had to either say yes to Lincoln or no. And so this forces the upper southern states, including North Carolina and Virginia, to choose to side with the Confederacy. And that's important to note. North Carolina is actually one of the last states to secede from the Union, and then sadly, they are going to be the state that ends up losing the most troops, at least among the Confederate states. They're going to be the ones that lose the most troops during the war. Virginia is very noteworthy because Virginia has the most factories of any of the Confederate states, and you need factories to fight a war. Factories produce weapons, factories produce uniforms, factories produce shoes for the marching soldiers. So you're going to need factories, and so Virginia represented a more industrialized southern state that could provide some of these factory produced weapons and war materials. There's another reason why it's especially important to note Virginia leaves the Union. It's one of the more populous states. When Virginia leaves, the Confederacy gets a lot more soldiers than it would have had otherwise. Finally, a reason why Virginia is so important is because some of the best Confederate generals in the war, honestly, some of the best generals in the war, period, including Robert E. Lee, come from Virginia. In fact, Robert E. Lee, and I'll probably make this point again in a later lecture, Robert E. Lee was offered to be general for the Union troops. He was got that offer from Lincoln, but whenever Virginia seceded from the Union, Robert E. Lee's loyalty to Virginia, for him, meant more than loyalty to the federal government, and so he will end up fighting for the Confederacy, even though his position on slavery was not, he was not exactly the most enthusiastic when it came to promoting slavery. More on Robert E. Lee later on. But at this point, now you have 11 states seceding from the Union, and some other slaveholding states, for example, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, they're going to be thinking about seceding from the Union too. And Lincoln is going to have a problem. These are known as your border states. I will go ahead and tell you that midway through the war, West Virginia breaks away from Virginia, largely because it was a mountainous region. It was not dependent on cotton. It was not dependent on slavery. So it will not end up becoming part of the Confederacy. These states here that I'm showing with a mouse are going to be known as the border states. The states that form the border between the federal government and the Confederacy. None of these states will secede from the Union, although some of the people in these states wanted to. And all of them, except for West Virginia, interestingly, will continue to have slaves for a while. At this point, Richmond is going to become the new capital of the Confederacy. So the capital is going to move from Montgomery, Alabama, all the way up to Richmond, Virginia. And some people think that would say this was a dumb move because you're moving the capital of the Confederacy not too far away from Washington, D.C. The reason that they moved the capital to Virginia was, again, because more of the population was in Virginia and because more of the factories that were needed to produce weapons and uniforms and other war materials. You needed the capital close to those factories in order to coordinate the war effort. And in fact, much of the war is going to be fought in and around Virginia. And it made it easier to conduct this part of the war if the capital was nearby. Richmond, Virginia and Washington, D.C. are not very far away from each other. So at this point, Richmond becomes the capital of the Confederacy. Now on to those border states that I was talking about. So the border states were the northernmost slaveholding states, like Missouri, like Kentucky, like Maryland, like Delaware. And they're going to form the border between the northern states and the southern states. So they still had slavery, but they had not seceded from the Union. And Abraham Lincoln was desperate to keep them from seceding from the Union. Why was he desperate to keep them from seceding from the Union? Because the further north you go, the bigger the population gets. So if even more states secede from the Union, the Southern Army is going to get bigger and bigger and detract from the Federal Army. So if many more states left, the Southern Army might be bigger than the Northern Army. Or to be more accurate, the Southern States Army might be bigger than the Federal Army. So Lincoln is going to be very desperate to keep the border states from seceding, but especially the slaveholding state of Maryland. Maryland was crucial. If you look at this map here, you can see where Washington, D.C. is, the capital of the United States. And if you look at it, Virginia is right here. And the only thing separating Virginia, which had joined the Confederacy, from the capital of the United States was the Potomac River. That was it. In fact, Robert E. Lee used to own the property where Arlington National Cemetery is. Robert E. Lee could see Washington, D.C. from his house across the river. If Maryland seceded from the Union, then all the land surrounding Washington, D.C. would be Confederate land, and the capital of the United States would be surrounded by hostile territory, and pretty easily and pretty quickly, the capital of the United States would fall. Abraham Lincoln would probably be taken hostage or maybe even killed. They could take the whole government hostage, and the Confederacy probably could have won the war pretty quickly had they been able to take over Maryland. So Abraham Lincoln is going to take special, extraordinary, and controversial measures to make sure that Maryland did not join the Confederacy. And what he did arguably was unconstitutional, but a lot of people that defend Lincoln say that if he had not stretched or slightly torn the Constitution in Maryland, then there would be no Constitution left because the United States would have broken apart. And then in the future, you might have had even more states secede from the Union, and eventually you may have no union of states left. So Lincoln, when it came to Maryland, is going to impose martial law. He's going to send soldiers into Maryland, and these soldiers are going to serve basically like police officers. If you speak about secession and that you are heard doing so, you might be put in jail and held without a trial. Whenever they had elections, the elections were not free elections. They were supervised, and if they knew that you were voting for people that favored secession, then you might be put in jail also. So again, the elections were not free in Maryland. You had martial law, meaning that soldiers were serving as police officers. If you even spoke of secession too loudly, again, you might be put in jail without charges, without a trial. And these are violations of the Constitution. And a lot of people felt that Lincoln was violating the Constitution in doing so. And so you do have some people, especially in the South, that don't like Lincoln. And one of the reasons they don't like Lincoln is they say, even today, that Lincoln violated the Constitution. On the other side of that argument, though, you could argue that if Lincoln had not violated the Constitution, Maryland would have definitely seceded from the Union. The capital of the United States would have been surrounded, and then the southern states could have gotten away with what some would say would be treason, and they could have taken over the capital of the United States. They could have deposed Lincoln. They could have deposed the federal government, and so you can see both sides of the argument. Lincoln violated the Constitution, but did he really have a choice if he wanted to keep the United States from breaking into pieces? Okay, now we're going to get to a chart. And again, make sure that you get the middle box of the chart accurately or correctly labeled. Oh, but let me pause for a second. Let me review with the map here. Here's your southern states, now Confederate states, so they claim. Here's your upper south states, now Confederate states, so they claim. And then here you have the border states, and they will not join the Confederacy, although there were people in these states that wanted to. Lincoln is going to stretch the Constitution, if not violate it, to keep these states from joining, especially in Maryland, because he did not want Washington, D.C. to be surrounded. Okay, so in the middle rectangle of this chart, put either causes of the Civil War, or if you want to be a little bit more accurate, you could say causes of Southern secession and the Civil War. So again, your two options for the middle rectangle are either causes of the Civil War, or to be technically more accurate, causes of Southern secession and the Civil War. One more time, again, causes of the Civil War, that or causes of Southern secession and the Civil War. And what you'll notice with all five of these causes is you're going to see that slavery might not directly be the cause, but it's kind of like the lowest common denominator in the cause. So first off, let me actually repeat that point for emphasis. Slavery might not be directly every single cause, but you will see it as a common denominator in all five of the causes. Okay, so the first cause of the Civil War is going to be the issue of federal power versus state power. And this had been debated since the Constitution. The 10th Amendment had said that issues that were not addressed by the federal government, or powers that were not given to the federal government, went to the states. And a lot of the southern states had a long tradition of promoting state power over the federal government. And by this point, they felt like the federal government had grown way too powerful. And on top of that, they felt like the North had kind of hijacked the federal government because they had more population. And they had several examples to look at looking back. So again, you should think about this as bringing a lot of American history up to this point together. So before this point, there had been economic plans like Hamilton's financial plan, which had benefited the North and had hurt the South. There had been Henry Clay's proposed American system, which again had benefited the North and largely the West, but hurt the South. There had been the Bank of the United States that had been created twice by this point that the North liked and the South didn't. So when it came to these big federal government plans, the North had gotten its way and the southern states had not gotten their way. And over time, more and more, the southern states felt like the federal government was getting stronger and stronger. And at the same time, the federal government was starting to listen to the North more and more. And what's the North starting to say in the 1850s? They're starting to say things like slavery is wrong, slavery is a sin. Some said that slavery shouldn't spread. Some say that slavery should be abolished everywhere. So by this point, the southern states again feel like the federal government has gotten too strong, and now the federal government is leaning towards the North's view on slavery. And so when southern states historically had felt like the federal government was doing something they shouldn't, or they felt like the federal government was doing something they didn't agree with, then they had the right to nullify a federal law. So to a lot of southern states, when they seceded from the Union after the 1860 election, in a sense, they were nullifying the results of the election. They hadn't even put Abraham Lincoln on the ballot, and they refused to recognize him as their president. So again, This idea of nullification comes up, the idea that when a state doesn't like something the federal government does, that they can just refuse to go along with it. So here you see the states' rights argument coming in to play again, and again the southern states are feeling that the federal government is a threat to slavery. They're going to nullify that federal government, they're going to nullify the election of Lincoln, and form their own country with their own president. So here you see that tension between the federal government and state power reaching a breaking point, and largely over the issue of whether or not slavery can be maintained in the southern states. The next cause of the Civil War was the ongoing vision for the country. Remember that the North had become increasingly based on manufacturing. They had had the Industrial Revolution. By the way, these factories are going to help them produce a lot more weapons than the South can produce. That'll be a major advantage for the North later on. I'll come to that later in the next unit. But again, the North had become more manufacturing based, more factory based, more trade based. They were building more railroads, which will also help them in the Civil War. And the South was increasingly based on cotton and increasingly based on slavery to produce that cotton. And if you remember, when the federal government tried to make policies to promote economic growth, it was hard to do something that both the northern and southern states would both like. For example, the tariffs. Remember that federal tariffs helped protect northern businesses from foreign competition, so the North liked them, but the South hated tariffs because they had to pay tariffs to other countries when they exported their cotton. In fact, if you remember, during Andrew Jackson's presidency, which is kind of being referenced by this picture here, you had had the nullification crisis over the Tariff of Abominations, and that had almost led to violent action by the federal government against Charleston. And if you remember, Andrew Jackson even threatened to send a warship down to Charleston and blow it off the map, which he never had to do. But again, remember that we had seen this issue before, even with South Carolina, this issue of whether or not the federal government was going to promote policies that favored the northern economy or the southern economy. And again, largely had been over the tariff issue because the tariff hurt the cotton-based and, yes, again, slavery is being brought up, the slavery-based economy of the South. By the way, when the Civil War happens and the Southerners leave the federal government, the North is going to start passing higher tariffs. And in fact, the tariff is going to help the North pay for the Civil War. And the South, which did not like tariffs, will not be passing tariffs, and they're going to struggle to pay for the Civil War on their end. Okay, on to cause number 3, and that would be westward expansion. And I've brought this up multiple times. This is one of the bigger causes of the war. Remember that every time that the country expanded westward, gained more land out west, there was this tension over whether or not this new land would ultimately turn into free states or slave states. And we've talked about multiple times where this became a really big issue, and people like Henry Clay and others tried to come up with compromises to deal with this. So the Louisiana Purchase had brought in new land, and then people fought over whether or not there would be slavery there. Oregon brought in land, and the annexation of Texas brought in land, and that created tension over slavery as well. And then finally, the Mexican-American War was the last major piece, or led to the last major piece of land being brought into the United States that caused tension over the slavery issue. And remember that there have been multiple compromises that have been put in place to try to deal with this. Most notably, the Missouri Compromise attempted to deal with the issue of slavery in the Louisiana Territory, and it was successful for about 3 decades. And then whenever we brought in land from Mexico with the Mexican Cession, you had the Compromise of 1850. Both of these compromises, by the way, that came from Henry Clay. But both compromises ultimately were going to fail. You know that eventually the Missouri Compromise is going to be overturned by the Kansas-Nebraska Act and later ruled unconstitutional by the Dred Scott case. And then on top of that, the Compromise of 1850, it really failed to provide any long-lasting compromise, especially because of the Fugitive Slave Act. So, westward expansion and the future of slavery in the West is one of the more major causes of the Civil War. Again, as you see, slavery being the common denominator in the causes of secession and ultimately of the Civil War. So let's get to that common denominator now. So the biggest cause, the main cause of Southern secession was the issue of slavery. If the Southern states hadn't felt like slavery was threatened, the Southern states would not have seceded from the Union. And you can look at the Southern states and the documents they provided when they seceded, and their reason for seceding is going to be mainly slavery. Okay, so on to the issue of slavery itself. So over time, the North had become increasingly less tolerant of slavery, the North had, and then the South had become increasingly more defensive of slavery. And the two sides had become less able to compromise on the issue. And there are multiple things, as you can see, that I just brought up, that make the slavery issue become a bigger and bigger deal. The Second Great Awakening is going to make a lot of people see slavery as a sin. And a lot of people are, when they see slavery as a sin, they will no longer be willing to compromise on whether or not to allow it. So that gives birth to the abolitionist movement. The abolitionist movement is going to gain strength over time. It's a vocal minority movement at first, but then when things like the Fugitive Slave Act come along and people see Northern blacks being captured, even free Northern blacks being captured and taken to the South, you're going to see more people join the abolitionist movement after that. Uncle Tom's Cabin, when it is published, is going to make even more Northerners be less tolerant of slavery and in favor of abolitionism. When the Kansas-Nebraska Act is passed, it allows for slavery to expand out west on the grounds of popular sovereignty, and it leads to a mini civil war in Kansas over what issue? Slavery. Whether or not you'd have slavery in Kansas. By the way, Kansas ultimately does become a free state. But you saw that the fighting there was over the issue of slavery and really slavery in the West. And then that gives birth to the Republican Party. And one of the Republican Party's main issues that it promoted was the idea that slavery could not expand westward. And a lot of abolitionists would join on to the Republican Party, even though technically it was an abolitionist party itself. But again, that party did address the issue of slavery. And all of these things, the Second Great Awakening, the abolitionist movement, especially the Fugitive Slave Act, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act, are going to contribute to more and more division over slavery. And then when the Republican Party is elected into power, at least a Republican president is, and Abraham Lincoln, the South feels like the threat to slavery has gotten too great. And that brings me to the last cause. And this is going to be the breaking point cause, or the straw that broke the camel's back, if you will, and that will be the election of Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln's election will be the single moment where the other four causes kind of reach their breaking point. So in the Republican Party candidate, Abraham Lincoln, is elected, the South is going to see him as a threat to slavery, even though he himself is going to say in his inaugural address that if this fight happens, it's going to be the South that starts it. And when it came to Fort Sumter, Lincoln kind of baited the South into starting it by making them fire first. Lincoln, even at the time of Fort Sumter, is going to say, I am not trying to get rid of slavery where it already exists. I am just simply trying to keep it from spreading any further westward. But again, to the Southerners, this was just as bad as threatening to get rid of slavery everywhere. So the Southern states at this point, in a sense, nullify his election by saying he is not our president, and they claim to secede from the Union or break away from the Union. And again, remember, Union means Union of States or the United States. And they are going to say, we are forming our own country, the Confederacy, the Confederate States of America. We're going to elect our own president, Jefferson Davis. And if you don't want us to secede from the Union, you're going to have to use force to stop us. And that is what causes the Civil War to happen. So to be most accurate, and you might want to star this last bullet here, draw a little star on it, highlight it. To be most accurate, secession happens because the South felt like slavery was threatened by the federal government now that Lincoln was president. That's what causes secession. What causes the war was Lincoln's effort to use the military to forcibly stop, with violence, the secession from happening. So there is a little bit of a technical difference there. It's actually a major technical difference. Southern secession, again, happened because the South felt like slavery was threatened. Regardless of what Lincoln said, the South felt like slavery was threatened, so they seceded. The war was to stop the secession from happening. So finally, this brings us to the purpose of the Civil War, at least for the federal government, at least for Lincoln. Highlight this, underline this, star this whole rectangle, this whole last box. You need to highlight it, make sure you understand it. When the war starts, when the fighting starts, when the first official battles begin, the purpose of the Civil War was not to attack slavery. Remember, Lincoln was not an abolitionist. The purpose of the war was to preserve the Union. Granted, the Union was breaking apart because of the issue of slavery, but Lincoln's purpose was not to end slavery. In fact, Lincoln was quoted as saying that if it takes keeping slavery to preserve the Union, then I'll do that. If it takes getting rid of slavery to preserve the Union, then I'll do that. Regardless of slavery was the secondary at best in Lincoln's mind. His number one priority was to preserve the Union. In fact, if he couldn't preserve the Union, there's nothing he could do about slavery because the southern states would become their own country. So keep in mind that his purpose is not to end slavery. The purpose is to preserve the Union. But notice with this last bullet of the lecture that I say that his purpose is not to end slavery at first. Eventually, he is going to tack on the abolition of slavery or the ending of slavery in the Confederacy as another purpose of the war, but not at first. It's kind of like he has an ace up his sleeve, and that ace up his sleeve is adding the ending of slavery to the war, but he has to play that card at just the right time in order to win the Civil War. So again, the purpose of the Civil War, number one purpose, is to preserve the Union. It is not to end slavery at the beginning, although that will come into play with the Emancipation Proclamation later on. So one more time, the reason the southern states seceded from the Union was because they felt the federal government was a threat to slavery. But Lincoln's purpose for fighting the Civil War is going to be to preserve the Union at all costs. Eventually, ending slavery will end up becoming one of those costs. And I'll talk more about that in the next unit, Unit 7. So in Unit 7, we will talk about the Civil War. We'll talk about the battles of the Civil War, the major turning points, social issues, political issues. We'll talk about the battles, and then we'll talk, once the Civil War ends, we'll talk about the Reconstruction of the South and the status of Southern blacks once slavery ends. So that will be Unit 7. We'll get to that later. Hope you enjoyed Unit 6.